So my name is Mark Steer. I'm the director of the Pennsylvania Budget and Policy Center. We're an organization based in Harrisburg with offices in Philly and Pittsburgh as well. We're an organization that focuses on trying to figure out how to create broadly shared prosperity in Pennsylvania. And we do that through research and policy analysis, through advocacy, various kinds, our blogs, our papers, our op-eds, our videos these days, podcasts, and also through organizing. We're part of a group called Pennsylvania's Choice, which is a campaign for a state budget that tries to fix Pennsylvania's upside-down tax system and provide the revenues that can create and sustain the social programs that we know are necessary to create broadly shared prosperity. So, thanks again for inviting me. Let me first begin to tell you what I'm going to talk about. And we've changed the agenda around a little bit. I'm going to start talking about something I was going to finish with, because I know some folks are really interested in this topic, and that's this Constitutional Amendment, Joint Resolution 1. I'll say a few words about it, not much. To be honest, I think it's not all that exciting, and I have really no strong feelings about it. I myself haven't even made up my mind how I'm going to vote on it, and I don't think our organization's actually going to take a position. And I'll explain why. But then I'm going to jump into some really meaty things. I'm going to talk a little bit about the state budget impasse, the current dispute. Then I'll talk a little bit about the context in which that dispute takes place, the changes in our government, changes in taxes that have created persistent structural deficits in the Commonwealth. And I'll try to explain why that happens. And you'll see the answer is largely that we've cut taxes so much we don't bring in enough revenue to provide the minimal government that Pennsylvanians need, not to mention the government a lot of us Pennsylvanians think we really should have. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about taxes and talk about a couple of tax ideas that could bring in new revenues and that could enable us to sustain a government that really would move us towards much more broadly shared prosperity in the Commonwealth. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about property taxes. I'll come back to where I started and talk a little bit about education funding, why we have a property tax issue in some parts of the state, if not others, and how we can fix it. And along the way, I'll talk about the SB 76 proposal, which some of you may have heard of, which I think is really quite dangerous. I was going to end with the Constitutional Amendment, but I'll start with it because it's probably something that's on a lot of your minds. The point of this Constitutional Amendment is to allow local communities, local governments, and school boards to give property tax relief to homeowners. It would allow them to increase the exemption of property tax from what they're now allowed to do at 50% up to 100%. Now that sounds like, wow, wonderful thing, cut our property taxes. Except here's the kicker about this. By itself, this Constitutional Amendment does almost nothing. Because like a previous Constitutional Amendment, which allowed exemption up to 50% of homeowners' value, nothing can happen unless there's enabling legislation from the General Assembly. Because the goal here isn't just to cut property taxes. The goal is also to fund our schools. So there has to be some way to replace those property tax revenues in the schools. And the General Assembly has to provide some mechanism to allow local school boards to fund the schools while also reducing property taxes. And there are two kinds of mechanisms they could use. They could replace local property taxes with state funds through some system of providing state funds to replace those property taxes. Or they could give local communities and school boards the right to raise other kinds of taxes, like an earned income tax, which actually took place under the enabling legislation for the previous amendment, which created the same thing up to 50% of median value. One other way which we've already started to reduce property taxes is by using gambling revenues to help fund some of these homestead programs. But again, the key point is nothing happens unless there's enabling legislation, and then the local school boards take advantage of that enabling legislation. So the question, is this a good idea or is this a bad idea? It's really hard to say unless you know what would the General Assembly do. Now, the weird thing about this is people on various sides of the political divide, with various positions about property taxes, have different ideas about whether this is a good idea or not. Some people, just to skip ahead a little bit, you may have heard of this idea, SB 76 or HB 76. These are folks who want to totally eliminate all property taxes in the state for schools. I'll describe that proposal in more detail later. I have to say, just for now, it's just about the craziest piece of legislation I've ever heard of in my entire life. And I've been a political scientist for 25 years. It simply doesn't make sense. Even if you think, as I do, that we have a property tax problem in at least some parts of the state, this is not the way to fix it, because it would just lock in the greatest inequalities we have in school funding and limit the ability to raise more funds for our schools. Now, some folks who support SB 76 thinks that this constitutional amendment will make it easier to move to pass 76. And I have to say, if I thought that were the case, I would say I would definitely vote against this constitutional amendment. However, I'm not sure that's actually true. And the interesting thing is I've heard a lot of people who support 76 say, this is just a dodge. This is just a way to pretend that you're doing something about eliminating property taxes, but not really doing it because, as I just pointed out, by itself this does nothing. So the question is, if this amendment passes, would it help us pass 76? Would it make it more likely? I think the answer is pretty much no. Whether 76 passes or not really depends a lot more on who we elect in the General Assembly in 2018 than on whether this amendment passes. And I have to say right now, I don't think the prospects of passing 76 in the General Assembly are very good, even under the current General Assembly. So I'm not that worried that this is going to lead us down a dangerous path. On the other hand, there might be some good things about it, because one of the nice things about this proposal is it allows us to reduce property taxes for homeowners without reducing property taxes for businesses. And as you know, we have what's called the uniformity clause in the Constitution. Or maybe you don't know it, but you should know it. This is the greatest barrier in this state, aside from the right-wing extremists who are too much dominate the Republican Party, to really good government. Because what it says is you have to tax every class of income at the same rate. You know, a lot of states have graduated income taxes. So if your income is low, you pay at one rate. If your income is in the middle, you pay at a higher rate. If your income is very high, you pay it at a much higher rate. We cannot do that in Pennsylvania. The Constitution does not allow it. The uniformity clause prohibits it. Later on in my talk, I'm going to say a little bit about how we can get around that with our fair share tax idea. But it's a huge barrier to raising a lot of revenue, because if you think about, if you can't tax the people who have money more, it's very hard to generate enough taxes in the state. Now, the same thing is true with regard to property taxes. In a lot of states, you can tax residential property at a lower rate and commercial property, business property, at a higher rate. And that tends to make the property tax a little more fair in terms of taking more from people with higher incomes. We have not been able to do that in Pennsylvania except through the homestead exemption and the previous amendment, which allowed an exemption up to 50%, up to the median income of property in an area, went partway. This goes a little bit further. So there might be ways, and we are trying to work on some ideas about how to target the areas where property taxes are really hard and provide relief for them, where those proposals would be easier to do if you had something like this amendment passed, because you could reduce property taxes for residences without reducing property taxes for businesses. And that would probably make the property tax more fair. So this is a long way of saying there could be some good stuff that comes out of this amendment. There could be some bad stuff that comes out of the amendment. By itself, it does nothing. It just puts off the fight a little later. And thus, I don't think there's too much reason to worry about this passing. I have to tell you, I think it's probably going to pass, because these things almost always pass. For some reason, You know, people are, even in the foul mood the electorate is in now, where they want to throw out all the incumbents except for their own state representative, who they all love. Partly because they're all as charming as Representative Pashinsky, partly because they know their names and they don't know their other people's names. But even with the foul mood, when people see a ballot amendment and there's a yes or no, they almost always vote yes. I chalk it up to the innate good nature of human beings, which is kind of hidden from us now at this point, but I expect it'll show up on Election Day. So I know some people are really excited about this and want to organize to stop it. You know, you make your own decision. But I'm not encouraging anyone to spend a lot of time worrying about that, because I think we have a lot bigger fights on our hands than stopping this obscure amendment that God knows what it's going to do right now. So, any questions about that before I go on to what I think is a lot more interesting stuff? Yes?
Because I used to live in Colorado.
Uh-huh.
Is that going to do anything to the Homestead Act itself?
No, that's a different
okay,
issue.
I know.
I don't think we have homesteading in Pennsylvania anymore.
They do in Colorado, and
Yeah.
I know that has helped a lot of people save their homes.
Right.
Because they had the homestead days there. That, you know, houses that have been in their families for generations, if something happens, they can take the land, but they still get their home. And that's why I'm wondering if they're going to start sneaking, since you don't have it, though, I don't have to worry.
No, I don't think we have anything like that in Pennsylvania.
Okay.
Why do you think the legislature was interested in getting this on the ballot?
I think the people who, well, there are two reasons. One is I think some of the folks who support 76 who say this is a dodge are probably right, and that it was a way to act as if you're really accomplishing something about property taxes when you're probably not. Another is, and the other theory is, they wanted to encourage the 76ers, who tend to be really conservative, to come out and vote in an off-year election. I don't know which theory makes sense. I'm not sure people are going to be coming out to vote for this, to be honest. Maybe in a couple places.
School people who want to see that, are they thinking about this?
I haven't heard anyone who talks about charter schools connected up at all with this.
Okay.
There may be some obscure connection that I've missed, but it's certainly not obvious to someone who pays attention to this on a fairly regular basis. And interesting, a lot of Education Voters Pennsylvania, which is a really strong advocate for our schools, they've taken the same position that we have. And in fact, we consulted for a long time talking about it. They said, you know, we don't think it matters that much one way or the other. A lot of the school board associations and the associations of superintendents, they haven't taken a position either. PSCA hasn't taken a position. We're all trying to explain what it is, but it's just, I think to a large extent it's a distraction. Any other questions?
No, that's what I was going to ask. The groups that are strongly opposed, who is it?
I've seen a lot of the indivisible groups, resistance groups, take strong stands. I think mostly because they associate this with SB 76, and they very much oppose that, which I do as well. Pennsylvania Citizens for Children and Youth just put out a statement that was totally about SBS 70. Well, they may not have put it out. I saw a draft of it. It may come out next week. And it's basically all about 76. And I talked to the executive director, and I said, Donna, what's that about? She says, well, this is a good opportunity to tell people why 76 is a bad idea. And I said, great, let's do that. And she said, you know, because otherwise no one's going to pay attention to it. So I'll tell you a little bit more about why 76 is a terrible idea, but we'll get to that in a little bit. Any other questions? Okay, great. So I want to talk a little bit about the current budget dispute. And again, I'm going to be fairly brief on this because what I really want to get to is the long-term perspective. We're about at the end of this budget dispute, although I've said that probably every month for the last 4 months. It's gone on way too long for me. I've got a lot of long-term plans I want to be getting to, and this endless need to respond to the latest proposal has been a drain on me and my staff. My communications director just went on paternity leave, and he told me when his wife was pregnant, don't worry, it'll be our downtime when I go on paternity leave. And I'm still waiting for the downtime to happen. This is the problem the General Assembly faced last March. This is what the budget looked like. the upcoming budget for the current year. We were estimating that there'd be about a $935 million deficit in the last fiscal year, the one that ended June 30th, and that in the current fiscal year, the one that began July 1st, we'd be looking at about a $2 million deficit. So this chart I did in March. When I updated it this was probably in early June, the estimate for the deficit for last year had increased to 1.3 billion. And the main reason for that deficit is a couple of things. One is a couple of the things the General Assembly passed didn't happen. A couple of things they said they were going to pass didn't happen. And revenues came in very weak last year. No one knows exactly why. The economy in Pennsylvania has been toddling along. It's not really robust, but it didn't really go down that much. A lot of people think the reason is that business people were putting off income to the current year because they expected President Trump and the Republicans in Congress to pass a tax law that would save them a lot of money. And we still don't know if that's going to happen. But the idea was, let's put off income to next year when taxes will be lower. And when you do things to put off income to the federal government, it has the unfortunate effect of affecting revenue to the state government. Revenues for the current year are actually coming in much better. And again, the economy is not all that much more robust, so maybe this theory makes some sense. Anyway, we were looking at a problem of roughly $2 billion or $3 billion total at the beginning of the year when the governor put forward his budget proposal. Right now, we're looking at a smaller problem. If you look at the budget the General Assembly passed, it leaves about $1.3 billion left deficit from last year that has to be passed, and approximately $700 million for the current year deficit. So what the General Assembly did is they passed a spending plan that was less than the governor wanted, but more than the House Republicans wanted. It was an austere budget, but not a horrible budget. You know, we're in a situation with the General Assembly controlled by Republicans and the House controlled by a leadership that is really very, very far to the right, leadership that doesn't want to spend money for almost anything and doesn't want to raise taxes, that just continuing on the same path and adding a little money to education and intellectual disabilities and things and mental health and the opioid crisis, which is what this budget did, is an achievement. So we passed about a $32 billion budget deficit, which left about $2 billion unfunded. Now, the question is, how are we going to fund it? Well, before I get to that, let me just point out that the projected deficit was reduced by $1.4 billion. And that was done because the governor had proposed a number of ideas to save spending in the current year. Some very creative ideas, aggressive efforts to reduce unnecessary spending through staff reductions, through some consolidation plans, which he's pushing forward, even though the General Assembly hasn't totally approved them. They did some creative things to maximize federal reimbursements for Medicaid, and they made some aggressive efforts to collect taxes at the state level. And they basically saved over $1.4 billion without reducing services. And that's something you don't hear about. But it was really a big achievement of the governor working with the General Assembly. And there are a lot of ways in which I think this government should be bigger, but I don't want to waste money, and I think you don't want to waste money. So I think the governor and the General Assembly deserve some credit for reducing the projected deficit, which was $3 billion, by about $1.4 billion through some really smart ideas. And then the governor had some other smart ideas we haven't gotten to yet, but I think we will. So we have this. They passed this budget in the end of June, and have not fully funded it yet, and they had this kind of hole to make up. There've been a number of different budget plans this year, and I'm not going to be able to describe every twist and turn, because if I were to do that, we would be here till tomorrow morning about 9 o'clock, because there've been lots of different plans. But let me just give you a broad sense of the terrain. Everyone expects that we're going to borrow money to pay back the deficit from last year. Now, I was telling Representative Pashinsky before that I wrote a blog post about this saying, you know, when I was a young man, Republicans didn't borrow money to fund budgets. And, you know, technically the Constitution says that the operating budget has to be paid for in the current year. You're not allowed to go into debt. But, you know, in Harrisburg, like, what's a constitution among friends? It's, you know, they're going to kind of ignore that a little bit. And the reason for that is there's simply no way anyone could imagine that this General Assembly, particularly the House, which will not raise, so far has not raised a tax at all, has not voted to raise a tax despite about a $2 billion deficit. There's no way they're going to raise $2 billion of taxes this year. It's just not conceivable. And we have this deficit that mostly happened because of the revenue shift. So there's going to be some kind of borrowing. The House and Senate have both passed plans to borrow money on tobacco settlement revenues. You may recall the state's attorney generals made a settlement with the tobacco companies. We get anywhere from $200 to $400 million a year, sometimes 500. And what they're going to do is take some of those revenue, sell bonds based on paying that money back. It's not a great idea. I would, you know, if it were up to me, I would raise the revenues a lot higher and make up the difference. But as I said, it's just, and it's just not going to happen. And not only is it a bad idea because it's not really constitutional, it's a bad idea because it puts us in a deeper hole. Because the tobacco settlement revenues goes into the general fund to pay, particularly for health-related programs. And if we're using some of that money to pay back bonds, we don't have it for the to pay next year's budget. So that is going to put us deeper in the hole. Now, there was a time when it wasn't clear both House and Senate were going to vote for this, and so far they voted for different plans. So the governor said, I'm going to bypass you all since you're not doing your job, and I'm going to have the Liquor Control Board sell bonds based on Liquor Control Board revenues. I actually think that's probably a better plan for a couple of reasons. One is that the governor under law can bypass the General Assembly and thus doesn't have to give up anything to the General Assembly to get the borrowing plan he wants, puts him in a better political position. And second, because, and this is a little bit of inside baseball, by selling these bonds, it makes it impossible to radically privatize the Liquor Control Board. And I think for a lot of reasons, the privatization plans, which Speaker of the House Mike Terzai has been pushing for years, would be very, very bad for Pennsylvania. Even if you think we should make access to alcohol a little bit more convenient, the Liquor Control Board brings in an enormous amount of money to the state. Ending it would cost the state roughly $400 billion a year, $100 million a year, and we simply can't afford to do away with that. And we also, I don't think it's right to throw 4,000 good union-paid jobs out the window either.
Oh, I said out the window.
Right.
The exact same time you
Right.
said out the window.
So, we don't know how that's going to end. If the House and Senate pass a borrowing plan, will the governor decide, okay, I'll sign a plan based on tobacco settlement revenues? At the moment, the governor's really pushing ahead with the borrowing on the Liquor Control Board funds. I suspect he will try to just do that for now. And as I said, none of this is ideal. None of this is what they teach you in public administration school in the good government budgeting class. But we're kind of stuck. Now, how do we do with the rest of the budget? Let me say one other thing. If the governor does this plan, and if he does a couple of other things which he can under his own authority, not filling some positions, do some other ideas he's put forward, we can fund almost all the budget that was passed in June. But there's one important part of the budget that was left out, and that was funding for the state-related universities. Temple, Lincoln, Penn State, Pitt, and
State-related
yeah,
state
and
system. I always like to tell people that there's a difference.
there is a difference.
People don't know that.
There's a difference, and also the University of Pennsylvania Veterinary School. Now, what that means is those schools haven't gotten this money yet, and we have to do something. We need about $650 million in new revenues to to fund them, even if the governor does this borrowing without the General Assembly support. So, and the cost of that of not doing it is really very serious. The President Temple said a week or so ago, the money they get from the state is basically the money they use to provide in-state tuition discounts, which means Pennsylvanians who go to Temple might lose those discounts, which means their tuition would basically double. And it's a $50,000 cost over 4 years. That's how much the in-state tuition discount is. And there are a lot of people, as you can imagine, who have kids who go to Temple or about to go to Temple and who imagine the same thing happening with Penn State and Pitt and Lincoln, who are thinking this is not acceptable. And I think all of us who believe in higher education and who recognize how important providing higher education is to creating prosperity in this Commonwealth would say this is not acceptable either. So that's why we need new revenues still, or we need some revenues. So where are they going to come from? The question is it going to be new recurring revenues? Is it going to be money that comes in year after year after year? Or is it going to be one-time money, one-shot deals? Right now, the House has basically voted for a plan that mostly provides one-shot deals. There's about $50 million in recurring revenues in their proposal out of the $650 to $700 million we need. They want to raid special funds, which are funds that are set up for special purposes, where they say there's a pot of money sitting around no one's using, which they haven't demonstrated to anyone who knows this stuff that it makes any sense. They want gambling expansion, and whether you favor it or not, most of the revenues from that is one-time revenues from selling licenses. They want more liquor reform, which again, whether you favor it or not, it's mostly one-time revenues. Now again, whether these things make sense or not is one question, but if you're going to rely on them to fund the budget this year, it means you're doing it for 1 year, which means you're going to start the budget year in July, $700 million in the hole. And you know how hard it was to raise taxes this year? You know why it's going to be harder next year? It's election year, someone said. Yeah. No one wants, if they don't want to vote for tax increases this year, they're certainly not going to want to vote for tax increases next year when they're up for election. So to our mind, it's just irresponsible not to be seeking recurring revenues this year. As I say, the House is opposed to all revenues. The Senate's far more supportive. They passed a bill with substantial recurring revenues. And they passed a bill with a shale tax, a tax on severance tax on natural gas drilling. It was not a very good severance tax. It didn't raise a lot of money. It had a lot of environmental provisions that were really problematic. But it was a step in the right direction. And the Senate bill, for all its problems, at least passed a shale tax and recognized that we need new recurring revenues. And the House has not been able to pass a bill that does that. There actually is broad support for a severance tax. As I said, there's a bipartisan support for it in the Senate. I'm fairly certain, and we may find out this week, that if a good bill comes to the floor, a clean severance tax bill without a lot of environmental provisions, the Pennsylvania House will find a majority support for it. Because there are about 25, 30 Republicans and most of the Democrats, except for 4 or 5 out west, who would support it. The question is, can we actually get a bill to the floor? And the House Finance Committee last week voted for that bill, and then we'll see. On my way up here at 3 o'clock, I heard that the House is coming back tomorrow. We may see a vote as early as tomorrow on this, and I will tell you in a minute who you can call. Well, you probably don't have to get out your phone to call your state representative to tell him to vote for it. Just turn around at the end and encourage him.
Not too many of us have him, unfortunately.
Well, then I'll tell you how to contact your state representative.
I know where mine is. It's right down the street.
Okay. Well, go knock on his door. So that's where we are. That's where the current budget is. And let me stop there again, take some questions, and then I'm going to talk about the deeper issues. Why is this all so hard to begin with?
I have
Yes.
a question.
Yes.
I've been hearing a lot about that speaker, and he's really, really, really fighting the governor on just about everything the governor wants to do.
Right.
Why?
Why? Well, there are a couple of reasons. One is he actually is a very ideologically conservative figure. I mean, I think he actually believes this no taxes stuff. But in a minute I'll talk about the two different philosophies of government in this General Assembly, and he clearly believes the best thing government can do is cut taxes and cut spending. The other thing is, when it comes to the shale tax, he gets enormous amount of campaign contributions from the shale industry, which he uses to spread around to his members. It's a way in which he builds his power in the House. And then there's another factor. He's thinking about running for governor. So
It's like the trifecta, right?
it is a trifecta of bad motivations. Yes.
How about the cost of the legislature? $300 million, I think we're the second or third most costly legislature in the nation. A bicameral system as we presently have with the various staffs. I mean, it's really redundancy everywhere you look. And I'm just curious. I mean, we're talking about this crisis of revenue flows. Isn't anybody, seeing the advantage of perhaps, changing the structure of our government entirely in relationship to a unicameral system, or at least cutting back the number of these representatives?
I've had this debate with a lot of folks, and first of all, keep in mind, $300 million is 1% of the state budget. It's not a huge amount of money. As far as the number of legislators, I ran for state legislator once. I tell you, I think it's a really good thing that we have one office at the state level in Pennsylvania that you can run for and win by knocking on doors. You don't have to raise huge amounts of money to get on TV in a lot of those districts. I think it's a good thing that your legislators down the street from you. So I'm not a huge fan of shrinking the legislature, and I'm not a huge fan of cutting down the staff, because I think they do a lot of good work. I work with the staff members in both House and Senate. They're really, really good people there. I work more on the Democratic side, not because we're a nonpartisan organization, just because we tend to agree with them more. But every once in a while, I work with a Republican staffer, and I'm always been impressed by the high quality of the people who work there. So I don't think that's the problem. I think the problem is that we have a very divided government with two totally different philosophies of government, one in the governor's office and one in control of the General Assembly. I think ultimately, the problem is the voters have to make up their mind about what kind of government they want. Yeah.
So, because we have so many though, I mean, and because of Pennsylvania's campaign finance laws, it's really easy though to flip a district with outside money. So what do you think about that?
Well, I don't want to get too far away from the budget, but I'll just say, yeah, I mean, if you ask me what is the biggest reform I would make in Pennsylvania government, it's first redistricting reform, and second campaign finance reform.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah. And although I have to say, when at the state level, my interest in redistricting reform, let me skip that. I probably should. I probably shouldn't talk about this today. All right, so let's skip that. Okay. Any other questions about the current dispute? Yes.
When are we at danger again of programs not being funded, and like how long are we okay till while the stalemate goes on?
Right now, the governor can figure out a way to fund everything except the state-related universities. And he can't fund them at all because we haven't actually passed a funding bill. Appropriations bill isn't passed. The governor, if he can do this liquor control board borrowing, and I'm pretty clear he can legally, he can do enough other things to pay the bills this year. So I think that budget will be funded, more or less. Maybe some small things. But he can always put off filling positions or put off paying a bill a little bit to get through this year. The real problem is those state-related institutions are not funded at all. And I don't think they'll raise tuition mid-year, because my sister used to work in higher education administration. That's kind of just not done. You have students come in September, and you've told them what they're going to pay, and you don't like double it in January. But we are going to see sticker shock next year if they have to make back the money they didn't get this year. Yes.
During the last
budget impasse. And first of all, I'm the children's librarian at the Kirby Library in Mountaintop, and we were not able, we had to freeze our delivery services, where we have we're fortunate enough to have a delivery van that takes materials in between the libraries. So if a patron at my library requested a book from, say, the Euster House here in town, that book would be able to be picked up and brought to our library like a day or two later. That was frozen during the last budget impasse. I went to college at Clarion University, and so I keep in touch with quite a few folks from the western part of the state. I know some of us, probably a lot of us in this room already know this, but things are a lot more rural over there. There is not nearly as much money over there. There was quite a lot of talk of closing some schools over there because they simply did not have the money to operate. Do you think that, can you foresee that happening again this time, or do you
We're not going to have the problem of, because we don't have a budget impasse, because an appropriations bill was passed and there's enough money to fund it. We're not going to have there's a lot of terrible stuff that happened in the first year when Governor Wolf took over. You know, human service agencies having to borrow deeply to stay in business, and school boards having to borrow, and social service agencies and libraries. That's not going to happen. There is a threat to the state university system, however. And I think over the long term, you know, it's quite possible there's going to be pressure from the General Assembly to close some of the schools. There's supposed to be a study.
Some of the 14 Pashy schools?
To close some of the 14 Pashy schools. Yeah,
right.
there is some talk about that. I think that's not an imminent danger, but there's a study's going to take place. We have actually written a couple of papers in the last year, which if you go to our website and want to take a look at, and there's some summaries on our blog that show those schools are enormously valuable in helping people from the working class move up into the middle class, and if anything, are way underfunded. But that's a little different story. Any other questions about the current budget?
Sorry if I...
No, that's okay. That was a good question. Okay, so let me just give you a little context about, and I'm gonna do like 45 seconds of political philosophy, which is what I was a teacher of for many years. We've got two fundamentally different political philosophies at work in this state. We have some people who think that we need a vibrant public and private sector to have prosperity for all of us. And by the way, these are not partisan. They're Democrats and Republicans on each side of this. These believe that, you know, we need the best education for our kids, pre-K, K to 12, higher education. They believe we need good roads, bridges, and public transit. They believe we need great services for people who need help, who suffer from food insecurity or any of those other problems. They believe that part of prosperity is having clean air and water. And they're willing to raise taxes to fund these programs. And then there are other people who simply believe that the smallest possible public sector with the lowest possible taxes for the very rich and corporations is what makes us prosperous. Our view is that the second view is wrong and the first view is right. That when you cut taxes on the wealthy and corporations, that's who mainly benefits. When you cut spending programs for education and good roads and bridges and clean air and water and human services, you ultimately hurt the public. And in fact, ultimately, we think you hurt business. And you know, every once in a while, you meet some business people, particularly in the local communities, who say, well, of course we need transit and roads and bridges, and of course we need higher education because we need skilled workers, or we can't expand. This second view, to my mind, is a highly ideological view that's not based on on the experience most people in most local communities have. And while I presented this as ideological, I actually think the first view is almost common sense. And if you talk to people in local communities, you talk to business people, and even if you go out to some parts of the state where they vote for Republicans most of the time, the local Republicans often haven't gotten the message, the ideological message, because they say, of course we want funding for our schools, and we want a college, or we want a community college, or we want to expand the one we have. This is a highly abstract view that I think just doesn't make sense for people. But the fact is the General Assembly in the House, and to a lesser extent in the Senate, is controlled by people who have this view. And as I said, at the moment, the citizens of the state haven't decided, because they've elected a governor who holds the first view, they've elected people to the General Assembly who've put in power people who hold the second view. And if you want to know why we have a conflict and why we have such a hard time passing a budget, is because we can't easily do one or the other because of this great conflict. And that's why I'd say it's ultimately up to the voters who are going to have to figure this out. From the point of view of the second view, we have two deficits in this state. One is the budget deficit, but I have to tell you, the deficit that worries me more is the public investment deficit. You look at Pennsylvania and compare it to other states, and we don't look so good in terms of our public sector. We have the most unequal school funding in the entire country. We're 50 out of 50. Schools in rich districts get 33% more than schools in the poorest districts. And you know what? That's not an urban-rural thing. It's not, when I talk about schools being underfunded, I'm not just talking about Philadelphia and Pittsburgh, although they are. I did something last week. I started looking at schools in individual state representative districts, and I looked at about 10 state representative districts. And I looked at the 5 or 6 school districts in those districts. There were huge gaps within those districts themselves. And you look in a rural area. I looked in Lebanon County. I have a friend who's a state representative there. He's a bit of a right-wing kook, but he's my friend. And his district, there's one school district that's almost at the top in sort of funding, and one district that's at the bottom. And I said to him, Russ, how is that fair? How is that okay? Why does it happen? Because one school district has a lot of rich people living in it, in big houses, and a lot of business. And there's a big base for property taxes. And another school district down the road doesn't have a lot of businesses, doesn't have a lot of rich people, and can't raise their own property taxes. We've got long waiting lists for human services. One of the nice things about the governor's budget, he's addressed some of them. Intellectual Disability Services has a waiting list of 4,000 people who have intellectual disabilities and graduate from high school and then need help to live on their own, to hold a job. And there's a waiting list of 4,000 people, which means 4,000 fathers and mothers are having to deal with severely disabled kids, or not so severely disabled young adults, who could be helped to take care of themselves and to go out in the world and make a life for themselves, but they don't get the services. You know, in terms of opioid addiction, how many people are not getting the services they need. Same thing true in mental health. When we look at higher education, we are actually 4th from the bottom in spending in the whole country. We're 46th in the percentage of adults with a BA degree. How do you grow a modern economy if so few of the people 25 years and older have a BA? The state share of cost of higher education used to be 62%. Tuition was 38%. Nowadays, it's totally reserved. Now the state share of higher education is only 28%, and tuition 72%. We're 2nd or 3rd in terms of the level of student debt in the whole country. We have deficient roads and bridges. In Philadelphia, we call it the pothole tax. And even though we're putting more money into it, we went for a long time without fixing our roads and bridges. We underfund public transit, and our environmental regulations are not too bad, but they're also not as well enforced as they should be, because Department of Environmental Protection spending is 32% below what it was in 2007 to 2008. And as you may know, the demands on the DEP have gone up substantially since then, because we've had this big boom in fracking. which, whether you think it's good or not, and I actually think in a lot of ways it's economically beneficial, it's also potentially very, very dangerous if it's not regulated. And yet, we have very few people to regulate it. This public investment deficit seems to me our biggest problem in the state, not our budget deficit. So why don't we have both? We have budget deficits for a couple of reasons. One, because we have a corporate tax cuts. Second, because we have an upside-down tax system. Third, because we've been relying on short-term fixes. And not because we have spending increases. Because the fact is, you will hear politicians say, not any in the room, say we're spending more and more and more. That is simply not true. As a share of the gross domestic product, spending in the state has declined. It's declined, and this is the trend from 1996 to today. It's declined, about 10–15%. If you look at the first look at the average from 94 to 2011, expenditures were 4.71% of state's gross domestic product. In the Corbett years, they dropped to 4.37%. In the Wolf years, who some people call the most liberal governor in the country, they dropped again. We've been cutting spending in the first 2 years of the Wolf administration, and the budget that we passed this year is another cut, by and large. Obviously, the amount goes up, but the amount always goes up because of inflation, because the economy is growing. As a share of the economy, we are spending less than we have historically over the last 25 years. And if you compare Pennsylvania to other states, we spend far less as a share of the GDP. So don't let anyone tell you we have budget deficits because we spend too much. We spend less than we used to, and because we spend less than we used to, we have all these public investment deficits in roads and bridges and college education and in K-12 education. So what's the problem? Well, here's the first problem. This is the share of corporate taxes, the share of all revenues brought in by corporate taxes. Back in 1972, they were 30% of all revenues. Now they're down to about 17%. Almost cut in half. And by the way, both Democrats and Republicans contributed to this. They were cut under Governor Rendell's term as well. From '89 to 2003, corporate taxes, that's like the middle of the period, were 22.25% of all general fund revenues. If they were back at that level now, we'd have another $2.3 billion a year in revenues, right? Not only would we not have a deficit, but we'd have a surplus. We could be investing more in higher education and environmental protection and in pre-K and K-12 education. We were promised that these cuts in corporate taxes would lead to vast economic growth. Anyone seen it? No. No, we haven't seen it. In fact, you compare Pennsylvania to all the surrounding states, we're actually growing more slowly. And that's for two reasons. One, because we haven't raised the minimum wage, which adds to economic growth. And second, because our spending is relatively low and it's been declining. Every state around us is growing faster. And that's because we're not funding the public sector.
Even West Virginia?
Yes.
Okay. I figured.
So that's the first problem, corporate taxes. Second problem is we have an upside-down tax system. What this chart gives you is what percent of people's income do they pay in state and local taxes. If you go to the bottom 20%, where the average income is about $10,000, $17,000, sorry. They pay 12% of their income in state and local taxes. If you go to the middle, where the average income is about $50,000, they pay 10% of their income in state and local taxes. But you go to the top 1%, where the average income is $1.7 million, they pay 4% of their income in state and local taxes. And that's totally upside down. It doesn't have to be this way. You look at New Jersey, it's much flatter. You look at Delaware, it's much flatter. I'm going to go back just to one or two. Oops, I'm not sure how to do that. And all the while we're taking more taxes from people at the bottom and very little from people at the top, look what's happened to incomes. Since 1979, the income of the bottom 99% has gone up about 12%, and most of that goes to the top of the bottom 99. The income of the top 1%, whose income is now $1.7 million, has gone up 125%. So we've been cutting taxes on the rich while incomes have been soaring for the rich. Yes?
This story is being told all over the United States right now. This is not simply a Pennsylvania story, as you well know.
Except it's worse here.
But it's worse than it is in other parts of the country. But the income disparity over the last 20 years and the flow of income to the top 1% has been astounding.
Absolutely right.
Particularly under Barack Obama, may we add, okay? Republicans and Democrats have both been equal in this. The thing of it is, I mean, isn't there a point where you have to understand this in terms of being, you haven't mentioned the word, class struggle, and the need to engage in class struggle from both the political level as well as from the social level of these communities?
I think we got to struggle against this tax system, absolutely.
Well,
because
I think it's best defined as a class struggle.
well, that's fine with me. I'm not unhappy talking about that. Because the difficulty is, you know, if you're not going to tax, a lot of you are old enough to know who Willie Sutton is. Remember he said, why do you rob banks? Because that's where the money is. Why do you tax the rich?
Because that's where the money is.
Because that's where the money is. And if you're not going to tax the rich, if you're going to tax the rich at a third of the rate you tax poor people, you're not going to have enough money to fund your government. And that's fundamentally the problem we're facing right now. And then you add one, so there's New Jersey, there's Delaware's tax system is almost flat. The difference is, remember we talked about the uniformity clause and about how you can't have progressive tax rates, graduated tax rates? That's our fundamental problem. We have a flat tax in Pennsylvania, 3.07% for everyone. In all these states, property taxes and sales taxes take a little bit more from the bottom than from the top. But they're compensated by an income tax which takes more from the top than from the bottom. And so you get a mostly flat tax, and they bring in a lot more money than our taxes. Yes?
Why was there such a decrease in taxes on corporations? You know, by almost half. I mean, what was...
Well, there was a theory that this is how you grow the economy. And trickle down, and Republicans accepted it, even Governor Rendell accepted it. And look, we've seen the theory doesn't work. You look in during the Great Recession 2008, two states radically cut their taxes, Louisiana and Kansas. You know what's happened to their economy and their state budgets? They have totally tanked. Two states really increased their taxes to keep the public sector going, California and Minnesota, two of the most prosperous states in the country. Public sector contributes to economic growth, and you've got to raise taxes on the rich to fund it. And we have a very hard time doing that. The other problem is we keep kicking the can down the road. Last year, they raised $1.3 million in revenues. Half of it, more than half, was from non-recurring revenues because they won't raise taxes. And so every year the budget deficit gets deeper. All that borrowing we talked about before on Tobacco Seminole Liquor Control Board, it's just going to make the problem worse. So you have the long-term problem of corporate taxes and the upside-down tax system, and then you have the short-term problem of never raising taxes enough to balance the budget. So what do we do about it? I'm going to quickly do well, let me stop here and see if there are any questions, and I'm going to quickly do this, and then I'll stop, because I've been going on for a while, and I don't want to keep you too long. I could talk about this forever, but you know, I have to say I'm really happy you're all awake, because you know when you start talking about budgets, typically the reaction is people start nodding off. So I'm very, very pleased how attentive you are. Any questions? Any questions before we get on to how to fix the system?
In order to do a graduated tax in the state, it requires a constitution.
Right.
Is there any move toward that?
A bill has been introduced. A bill introduced every year. I think it's a very hard thing to do.
Yeah.
Certainly hard in this General Assembly. Maybe if the political complexion of the General Assembly changes, it would be easier. But I've got a way to work around that uniformity clause, which I'll show you in a minute. Any other questions before we get to that? All right, so very quickly. How do we fix the problem? One is we got to do corporate tax reform. We have actually a pretty high corporate tax rate, but no one pays it. 71% of corporations in Pennsylvania do not pay the corporate income tax. And they are not the corporations based in Pennsylvania, they're the multi-state, multinational corporations. Because they take advantage of what's called the Delaware loophole. All the, Toys R Us, Walmart, Target, they make no profits in Pennsylvania, if you look at their books. That's why they don't pay corporate taxes. No profits here. They make all their profits in Delaware. And they do that by their internal bookkeeping. So they get away, basically, with murder. Whereas if you're a Pennsylvania corporation and you just operate here, you're paying a very high tax rate. There's an easy fix for this. It's called combined reporting. 26 states have it. And what they do is they say, if you do 30% of your sales in our state, 30% of your profits are attributed to this state, and we're going to tax them. That's it. No fooling around. Every state uses the same basis because it's all one corporation. Doesn't matter what state they earn the profits in. It doesn't matter how they finagle the internal bookkeeping. You look at the total profits, you look at sales in your state, and that's how much you get. We could do that with combined reporting and actually lower the rate a little bit and bring in another $300 million a year pretty easily. We think. It could be a lot more. Here's the secret. No one knows for sure because they don't pay taxes, so we don't know how much money there is. Someday we'll figure it out by passing this law. Yes?
So what would it take to get combined reporting as part of the corporate?
House and Senate passes a bill and the governor signs it. There's no.
Is there any legislation?
We've taken small steps. I don't think anyone has introduced a combined reporting bill in Pennsylvania in a while. Maybe someone should, though. That's the first problem. Second thing is the severance tax. It is absolutely nuts that we are the only state that has substantial shale gas drilling that doesn't tax them. We have a small impact fee, and the rate is about 1.5% compared to the 5 to 6% in other states. It's just insane. You know, they always say, well, it's going to be passed on to consumers. Here's the fascinating thing about it. 80% of the tax drilled in Pennsylvania is sold out of state. Any of you heat your homes with natural gas or cook with natural gas? Any of you? You're paying a severance tax. You're paying Texas' severance tax. You're paying West Virginia's severance tax. You may even be paying Ohio's severance tax. Because our gas comes from other states. So we could pass a severance tax. It would barely affect consumers in this state. And they're not going to leave because they can't take the shale with them. So that's another no-brainer. The bill that's coming to the floor this week, I think would roughly bring in about $300 million in the current year. It would bring in probably $500 or $600 million next year as prices go up, and they are going to go up, and as we drill more, and that's going to happen because the companies have invested $3 billion in pipelines. In 2 or 3 years, we'll have $1 billion a year from this, and it's just going to go up afterwards. If we don't do it, that's going to be another billions and billions of dollars that we just let slide. We've already let slide roughly $5 billion in severance tax money. And finally, my fair share tax. You know how I said you can only tax any kind of income at one rate? So we were brainstorming about 18 months ago and trying to think, how do you get around this? And someone said, hey, there's this idea that people had. It's not my idea. It's been around for a while. And I said, well, that's a great idea. Let's run some numbers. So we went to this think tank in Washington we work with where they modeled our economy, and they gave us some numbers. The idea is you take our personal income tax, which has 7 categories of income, and you take one part, wages and interest, and you make that one tax. And then they take the other part, which is dividends, capital gains, business profits, estates, royalties, and gambling winnings. And you put that in a separate tax. And what you do is you raise the tax on this second category, which we call income from wealth, and you lower the tax on wages and interest. Now, if you think about it, who gets most of that income from wealth? The wealthy, right? It's almost by definition. So most of the 6.5% tax falls on the wealthy. If we raise that tax to 6.5% and lowered the tax on wages and interest, we'd bring in $2 billion a year, just like that. And then look who pays that tax. First of all, 60% of Pennsylvanians would get a decline. 26% would see no change in their taxes, and only 15% would see an increase. And look at where most of the increase comes from. Half of that $2 billion comes from the top 1%. Top 1% starts at $535,000 a year income, and as I said, the average is 1.7 million. Another 22% would come from the next 4%, people making $215,000 and more. And then as you go down, there's very little income, very little taxes down the scale. So it's a tax that raises most of the money, about 72%, 88% from people making $100,000 and more. But even people making 104 to 215, some of them would see declines as well. The average tax increase for the top 1% would be $20,000, but below that, you're not talking about a very big increase. And you're talking about people who could certainly afford it. And then down at the bottom, people get cuts on average. Actually, more people would get cut in the middle, but there's always, one of the funny things about this, there are people with low incomes from wages and interest who have very high incomes from wealth. Trust fund kids. I had friends I went to college with who, had earned no wages and interest, but got, $40,000 in dividends every year. So their incomes are fairly low, but they would pay a very high tax. It's okay with me. I think it's probably okay with most of them too. And here's the kicker. Even if we raise the rate to 6.5%, when you take the whole system together, the taxes on top 1% in Pennsylvania would only be 3.6% total, which is far lower than any of our surrounding states. So whenever I present this idea, people say to me, well, they're going to leave, all the rich people are going to leave. And my answer is, where are they going to go? There's nowhere to go. Because we're still below all the other states. If it were up to me, I'd put the rate up higher, but we got Senator Haywood and Senator Haywood and Senator Hughes and Senator Costa to introduce the bill, and I pushed them as far as I could. And they say, let's not go crazy here, Mark. Let's just get the idea out. So that's the fair share tax. And if you add all this together, $2 billion from this, $1 billion from severance tax, maybe $300 million from corporate income tax, and see how it grows over time. It's not all we might need, but we could close a lot of that public investment deficit without taxing working people in the middle class at all. Now, so let me stop there and see if there are any questions about this part of the presentation or about anything else. Yes?
How do you, one thing that I've observed is this increasing divide between rural Pennsylvania and urban Pennsylvania. Mm-hmm. There's a sense that amongst rural Pennsylvania, that urban Pennsylvania is taking more than their fair share, and that their money shouldn't go to support the layabouts in the cities, things of this nature. And they don't have the appreciation of the services provided in our urban communities. For something like, for what you're describing, which would be wonderful to happen, you've got to forge alliances between these rural people and these city people, and they've got to see the commonality between them. And how are you going to do that with a state that's so divided between these regions, and at the same time political parties who cater to this provincialism within their communities, both Republicans and Democrats? Rural Democrats are not that much better in terms of their support for urban communities than rural Republicans.
A lot are. But again, it's not. You're right. It's not just partisanship. I think one thing we're going to do is we're actually going to come out with a report. It's probably going to take me another 3 or 4 months to do, called Pennsylvania Rural and Urban Pennsylvania in Black and White. And what we're going to show in that report is that the problems people think are totally found in the big cities are found in rural Pennsylvania as well. I've already looked at some point. If you look at the number of people who receive public assistance, it's higher in a lot of rural communities than a lot of urban communities. Rural Pennsylvania is hurting badly right now. If you look at where economic decline is, if you look at population decline, rural Pennsylvania is really in bad shape. If you look at rates of opioid addiction, if you look at rates of education, there are rural counties that look like what we used to think of as a typical urban ghetto. And we are going to try to figure out ways to bring people together and show that they have a commonality of interest. And you know, the fact is we don't put more money into the urban areas. That's not even true. Philadelphia, even though it's one of the highest poverty cities in the country, generates enormous revenues for this state, which benefits people all over the state. Other cities, Wilkes-Barre, Pittsburgh, they're the revenue engines of the state. And we need to make clear to folks that, you know, your politicians have been kind of divide you from other people who may look different from you, but who are in very similar circumstances to you. So that's something we're well aware of, and we are going to try to help address it. But it's not easy, you're right.
Recognizing the problem is not understanding the method of approaching the problem, which is understanding the commonality of their working class experience among rural Pennsylvanians and urban Pennsylvanians. And that requires a new political orientation of our political parties to start organizing and encouraging a militancy among working class people, urban and rural, against the 1%, and all the visceral kind of anger that comes with militancy among working class people. And I don't see that happening amongst either one of the parties, and that's one of the reasons we're having this terrible slide down this desperate abyss into poverty and the desperation. We need a more appreciation for the working class as a unit of political organization against the two-party system, and a new party based on that.
Well,
How do you respond to that?
I don't think new parties generally work well in this country, but you can take over an existing party, and there's certainly lots of people in the Democratic Party who agree with you now. And what we're trying to do in our organization is put forward a platform that shows how we can create a Pennsylvania that works for everyone, not just for the top 1%. And we have tax ideas, we have ideas on education, we have ideas on healthcare we're developing, and higher education and work training, because I think one of the things we talk too much about, we don't talk too much about higher education, but we should be talking about other kinds of post-secondary education that help working people who don't necessarily want to go to college. So we have a program on that will come out probably in the next 6 weeks. And then we're going to try to do some ways of communicating. We have this idea for a series of videos where you get a rural white young person. It's a black screen. There's a rural white person and an urban black person. And they're talking about problems, say education or trouble finding a job or opioid addiction. And we show them both against this black screen, and one starts talking and then the other starts talking, and they finish each other's sentences because they're talking about the same thing. We think that might be a really dramatic way of making the point, hey, we're all in this together and we have common problems. And there'll be a section where they all talk about, hey, if we're doing badly, who's doing good? And that's where we go to switch to the other message that you're talking about. Yes?
I have a question about, I know you have a lot of focus on education, which I think is great. I heard a discussion about the funding for Penn State and Lincoln and so forth.
Right.
And that there was some concern that some of that appears to come without all the strings attached, of course, that the state-owned universities have.
Right.
And so, and that when asked to come to the table to kind of work together, they kind of didn't. I don't know if this is true or not, but I mean, obviously there's a distinction between the two. One's wholly owned, the other one's not. Right. But yet they get funding, and where do we find balance in that, I guess?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think there is some tension between the two systems.
Right. And
part of that tension has to do with the state-relateds have long tradition and really vibrant alumni bodies, especially Penn State, Pitt as well, though. And the Pashi schools, which do an amazingly good job, as we showed in a report we released a little while ago, don't have the same kind of loyalty and don't have the same kind of state support. We have to overcome that, and we have to have a plan to fund higher education that doesn't direct the money the wrong way. And the plan we're going to put out in about 6 weeks focuses on helping students, not helping so much institutions, partly to avoid that issue.
that's great.
Yeah.
This is just something that I'm throwing out there. I think that the reason that huge schools such as Penn State have that alumni loyalty, as you mentioned, is, and again, this is just an opinion, but primarily because of athletics. And number one, and number two, they are so much larger than the
Right.
Apache schools.
Right.
So, and a lot of folks, myself included, who graduated from Apache school don't, for the most part, tend to make as much money as those who graduated from Penn
Right.
State.
Yeah, that's what our report showed. We called it we call it, the first report was subtitled Engines into the Middle Class. Because if you look at which schools in this state help people from working class backgrounds enter the middle class, it's the Apache schools far more than the state-related. State-related is doing an okay job, but if you look at how many people, and part of it is just access. People in the from working class backgrounds, first generation college students, and as a college teacher for 25 years, I taught first generation college students because they're the most fun to teach. Apache is the incredible path forward for them, and we don't do enough to fund them. The other thing we don't fund is we don't do enough to help people know about the opportunities. We're going to do a report in a little while that shows this amazing data. If you look at north of the New York border, how many students in the southern tier of New York fill out the financial aid information, FAFSA, and you compare it to the northern tier of Pennsylvania. You're talking about areas very, very similar. The only divide is that border. In Pennsylvania, students fill out those forms at much lower rates, which means no one is pushing them to go to college. No one's telling them about opportunities for money to go to college. No one's giving them help. That's because the schools in those communities don't have guidance counselors and don't have the kind of support for them. And it's just a horrible thing. There are a lot of things about Pennsylvania that when you drill down into them, they're embarrassing. It shouldn't be this way because there's nothing wrong with Pennsylvanians that we can't do as well if we have the same kind of level of public support. Yeah.
Do you have a website to find this information?
Yes, pennbpc.org. It's not a great website, I have to tell you. We're one of the things I'm trying to do if we ever get done with the budget and I have time is we're going to totally revamp our website and make it incredibly accessible for people so that it's this kind of information that you can easily pick up on.
Yes.
We're going to have video and audio. It's going to be great, but we're a long way there. Right now, it's a place where you can find our 20-page reports, but I want to make it easier for people to get this information without having to read all those reports. Yes?
Yeah, I want to ask why Pennsylvania isn't going forward with doing the medical and the recreational marijuana. That would be good revenue for schools, for bridges, for roads, everything. Every state that has passed it has got millions. They've got so much money in Colorado that they are now paying people.
Yeah, actually, we have an organization like ours in Colorado, and I keep reading their reports on the revenue they're generating. We're going to do a report about the potential for recreational marijuana. And one of the great things about the state stores is they are a way to sell marijuana and recreationally in ways that are responsible. And in Colorado, they had to create that whole infrastructure. We have an infrastructure in place, and we ought to be taking advantage of it. I think it'll happen. I think it'll happen sooner rather than later. This is one of these things that Republicans do actually kind of. Some of them I talk to seem to like. The other thing, you remember I told you I wrote this piece about Republicans in my youth didn't support deficit spending. The other thing Republicans in my youth didn't support is vices. Now all the Republicans want to do is raise money with gambling and liquor, and some of them want marijuana. It's not that I'm against those things, but it is an interesting thing. That's the only revenue raising ideas they like right now are the things that their grandparents shuddered at. It's a strange world, huh? Yes.
This is a question maybe even for Representative Kuczynski. Just like all of these fixes sound like great ideas, but what's the appetite in Harrisburg right now to get any of this done?
Well, I'll tell you something. I have a question before I answer that, and that is to all the people that are here today. Did you know what Mark was talking about before you heard Mark talk today? Not really, right?
Some of it,
No,
but
no.
Not really.
Some of it is in your report.
You know?
Broken, is our government broken?
Oh, yeah, yeah,
So you read that. You see,
yeah.
and Mark, I'm not sure, whether this is part of you working this in or not, but I wrote a pamphlet called "Is Our Government Broken?" and underneath it said no, but there are people trying to break it. And a good 30 plus years ago, there was a group called ALEC, American Legislative Exchange Commission. Now, to be honest with you, I never knew about that until I was elected. And I find people on all levels of the economic structure that have no idea what I'm talking about when I mention ALEC. And that was started off as a group of very professional and highly successful businesses that got together to try to improve their bottom line, which was good. But then it turned into, well, how can we change the regulations so we can make more money? How can we change the laws so we can make more money? And they said the way to do that is to elect people to office. So what we are experiencing on a national basis, we are experienced in Pennsylvania. And I want to make this very clear. On both sides of the aisle, there are good, qualified legislators that work hard to try to take care of their constituents and move Pennsylvania forward. But there is a group of extremists that are really obstructionists. It's their way or nothing. Now, Mark has just presented some really viable, common sense, arithmetic decisions, arithmetic solutions here. And yet, it won't reach the floor because the extremists control it. So when Mark brought out about Marcellus Shale, because Pennsylvania didn't tax it at the level that it should have, at that 5%, we have lost over $2 billion today. And if we do not include Marcellus in this budget, we will continue to lose astronomical numbers. Now that's one of the things that have held up the budget. Part of my position is I am not going to support anything else out there until you give me a legitimate Marcellus Shale piece of that budget. And as Mark also pointed out, can you imagine a Republican saying that we're going to take the tobacco settlement money, which over 10 years is worth $3.5 billion, and we'll sell it for $1.1 billion? Illinois did that. Illinois did that. Or we're going to take that tobacco settlement money and we're going to borrow on that. We're going to borrow $1.5 billion. We're going to use the $350 million a year to pay it off. But then the taxpayers will pay an additional $500 to $700 million in interest. Those are not Republican ideas. They are extremist ideas. And Mark, I want to help you with that website because to me, the truth is what needs to be brought out. The facts need to be brought out. There is so much misinformation that has been thrown out, on all walks of media that a lot of folks have no idea what to think. All right? So Mark's presentation today is absolutely dynamic in the sense that, Mark, that truth up there is what could begin to turn people's heads. So as the gentleman pointed out before, the working class doesn't know this. The working class is working against each other. And one of the ways to get them to understand it is to show some of those numbers to show why they're poor and why they're going to remain poor and they will and their children will be poor. We're going back to the coal barons. You've got a job, but you're going to buy from the company store, you're going to rent from the company house. Got it? That's where they are going, and it's horrifying to me as a legislator to try to get that message out. That's why I wrote that article, Is Our Government Broken? The healthcare issue is another debacle that's only based upon profit margin, not on life and death, not on health, not on living or dying, but on the profit margin of the shareholder and the company. We're not talking about a commodity like buying a car or television here. We're talking about someone who has an illness, that they will go into bankruptcy because they don't have the right insurance. This is crazy, and we pay double for that. So pardon me, you asked me the question, and I've been holding back this whole time because I have nothing but the utmost respect for Mark Steer and the Budget and Policy Center. We invited Mark up here several months ago to testify when I had the policy hearing to demonstrate the truth about Marcellus Shale, okay? Because again, they constantly misinform the people and this, that, and the other thing. So I don't want to take up too much here, but the reason those good ideas don't make it to the floor, who controls the floor? Mike Turzine. Who funds their campaign? Marcellus Shale. Go on a national basis. Why did Marino have to drop out?
$100,000.
Because that's nothing. That is nothing. We're talking about tens of millions of dollars that's going to these legislators because they bought into the ALEC model. Those companies funded their campaigns, now they got to pay back to the companies.
How do we identify these people?
And I know Mr. Toomey
This
is one of them.
is one of the main things. The voter's got to be able to identify who he or she is elected. And it's very difficult to do that.
Well, I'm not going to say it's going to be easy.
Right.
Yesterday I had the pleasure and the honor of speaking at the Grange, since I'm the agriculture chairman now. And I said there are times in our history when it calls for all hands on deck. I know that many of us, are of retirement age, and we say, I worked my life, I worked hard. I'm telling you, there is so much at stake, all hands on deck. If our forefathers could do it in World War I, the Great Depression, World War II, Vietnam War, and now it's up to us. We got to carry the flag. So how do we do it? Mark, you better get that website up and running.
And the other thing we're going to do is we are working with some other folks, and I'm not going to say some labor unions and some others, to build what we're going to call something like the Campaign for Working Families.
Good.
Which is going to try to get these issues out, try to raise a lot of money to use all the tools we have in contemporary media to get the issues out. And while our organization does not do electoral politics, some people in that organization will, and they're going to tell you who's with working people, who isn't. By the way, it's not just Democrat and Republican, because I stood at a press conference last week with a Republican who supports the shale tax, and we've been working with about 15, 20 Republicans who support it. There are 5 legislators in the House of Representatives who I've talked to about this fair share. Well, actually, I've talked to a lot more. There are 5 who said they want to support it, want to introduce it at some point. Representative Brzezinski, I'm sure you don't mind if I say you're one of them.
Not at all.
One of them is a Republican, and there may be some others. This is not going to be just a Democratic thing, because it's not just a Democratic issue. There are people in both parties who understand that we need a vibrant public sector, we need to support working people, we need to raise taxes on the rich and the corporations to do that.
And your numbers prove it.
Yeah.
Your numbers prove it.
Do you think that redistricting bills will at least get up for a vote at some point in the near?
If they do get up to a vote for the state legislature, the reason is that Democrats control redistricting for the next 10, probably 20 years, because not at the congressional level, but at the state level, redistricting is controlled by a 5-person body, one appointed from each caucus in the General Assembly and one appointed by the Supreme Court. Democrats now control the Supreme Court, which means that there's a threat that the Democrats could do to Republicans what Republicans have done to Democrats for the last 20 years. That may be the greatest motivator for the Republicans to try to do some kind of nonpartisan redistricting.
Mr. Kuczynski, may I ask you a question? I came from our shared same generational experience. I was a committee man for 20 years, and the idea that we would ever lose our congressional seat in 2010, or that Trump would have the election in this past year, inconceivably to that person I knew in my youth and the Democratic Party I knew. I turn around, we're getting our heads handed to us. The Democratic Party has lost all credibility, it seems to, with the average rank and file voter in Luzerne County in Northeast Pennsylvania. There was just recently an article in Mike Tabbitt in Mother Jones Magazine. He said he never saw Trump at his best in his rally in Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania. He was hot, he was cool. 15,000 people were up there screaming their bloody minds out for this bozo. And, you know, the party folded. My problem is that I come out of the New Deal Democrats, okay? I came out of the coal regions of Pennsylvania, Larksville when I was a kid. I knew those guys sitting on the front porch without a dime in their pocket before Black Lung. And, you know, and I saw and I heard the stories about my grandmother putting the kids going down to Pig Slate in 1907, 1908, and having their hands in little bloody fingers. I lived with that. It turned me into a radical, and I've not turned my head since. But, you know, I vested my faith in the Democratic Party. And I really feel, I've really been having some real lousy burgers, if you know what I mean, the last couple of years. Barack Obama turned around, he gave trillions to Wall Street, trillions, and it goes unsaid that he's the great president.
Well, what I want you to think about, though, is this. I told you about Alec. That started right after Reagan, okay? The Democratic Party was the working class party. In order to compete with the money that the Republicans had, the Democrats also had to play ball with those other people in order to get enough dollars so that they could compete. I'm not saying it's right or wrong, I'm just trying to give you the information.
Will the Democratic Party survive what's happening? That's a good question.
Well, the Democratic Party has to survive if it means the survival of our country as we know it. Otherwise, we're going to become an oligarchy. And the billionaires will take over, and our grandchildren and our children are going to suffer. So I'm not going to stop fighting, I can tell you that. I also come from that ilk, half a double block in Nanticoke, Pennsylvania. My dad was a coal miner. I understand all that. That's why I'm alarmed. I'm living it down there. That's why I'm alarmed. And I cannot stand the kind of misinformation that is spewed on certain media centers. Got it? And that's why I'm saying Mark is showing us truth. Mark is showing us past history and fact. Those numbers don't lie. But the regular folks can't see it, and they're upset just like you are. But they're upset at all of government. Got it? Because they don't know about Alec. They don't know about those extremists who were doing the work to make us split and divided. And I'm saying you cannot allow yourself to divide it. Our unions can't be divided, and they're dividing that, and we know how they're doing that. So I just want to support Mark in trying to get the truth out, and I'm going to tell you this, there's been conversation, as I said, there's good Republicans and Democrats down there. I've had discussion with some of my Republican colleagues saying, you know what, fellas, you might be better off becoming a Democrat so we have something to deal with here, because I hear the stories from their side as well. Their caucuses are insane, the screaming and hollering, because there's some good Republicans that see we're going down the wrong path. But they don't have the power. See what I'm saying? So until we either do it through the election process, or there's some kind of coup down there and the Democrats and some of our Republicans can come together, it's going to be tough until those changes are made. Remember, a lot of those people that are in control, they're the extremists. They're the ones that are demanding certain things to happen. I can't vote for a budget that doesn't have Marcellus Shale. Yet I want to support my governor. He is the only defense we have. He's the only backstop we have. I want to try to do what I can to make sure he gets reelected, because if we don't have him, forget it. Forget it. That's why everybody's so upset on the Republican Party, because they have the president, the House, and the Senate, and they still can't get stuff done the way they want. You see what I'm saying? Sorry for getting a little emotional here, but, you know,
I relate. It's distressing.
No, I totally agree. It's we've got a distressing situation in Harrisburg, and we've got a distressing situation in Pennsylvania. Some of these numbers shocked me. You know, I've only been doing this job for just about 2 years now. And, you know, I lived in Philadelphia. I thought, well, Pennsylvania's another mid-Atlantic state, you know, a relatively progressive state. And then I started looking at the details of our budget and the public sector, which is so underfunded in this state and that provides so little compared to other states. It's not a good situation for our kids. It's not a good situation for the future of the state. It's not a good situation, certainly for working people and the poor. And we really need to do something about it.
By the way, Mark, if I could just add, so when you cut your agencies and your programs down to bare bones, and then all of a sudden they don't provide the service, then what does the other side say? See, government doesn't work.
Yeah.
It's designed to make government not work. If you wouldn't mind, if I could, please go to PA House /Pashinsky. And up there it'll pop up my healthcare issue that I'm trying to work on. Is our government broken? My grandparents raising grandchildren, and you know, a couple other things. But those two things there, if you would go to that, and believe me, I welcome any criticism. If you can show me where I may be wrong, please do that, because I don't want to disseminate anything that's incorrect. But I have done extensive work, and I've had a number of people verify what I'm saying to make sure that I don't mislead anybody. Thanks, Mark.
Any other questions? I can take it, but then I guess we can wrap up.
I
Yes.
just had a question for Ollie, for you, Dr. Kuczynski. Is there any way that we can combat ALEC? I mean, we see, you know, Vice President Pence at an ALEC, you know, corporate meeting. Is there any way that we can, as citizens, can combat them?
See, to me, the only way that we're going to be able to win for the good of the country and for the people is the truth. I will stand by the truth.
Yep.
I'll take some body blows, just like I took body blows on House Bill 76. They really chastised me. They picketed my office. House Bill 76 didn't work before, doesn't work now. And Mark, I don't want to take anything away because I know you were going to hit him up with 76, but it just doesn't work. And they have been modifying it for the last 5 years, trying to now deal with all the things that don't work, and it still doesn't work.
Yeah, that's really insane, and I don't know that we have time to go into it because I think we've been here a long time. But I want to suggest one thing. If you want to get more information about the budget, not just about information, but about how you can help, we have this organization called Pennsylvania's Choice. I think I showed you at the beginning. And if you want to sign up and get updates from us, I'll pass around a clipboard and some information. I'll tell you what we've been doing in the last couple of weeks. We've been working with our friends at SEIU to encourage Republicans to vote for a shale tax, and I actually think we've been doing it with Facebook posts. We've been doing it with mass emails that go out to people. We've gotten 4,000 to 5,000 letters sent to state representatives and thousands of phone calls, and we're doing office visits. Now, I don't know. I had a friend, State Representative Mark Cohn, his friend. He used to tell me when 3 people call him about an issue, it is a groundswell of public opinion. He says, because not that many people call. Now, maybe in your district more people call, but we found getting 20 letters to a state representative about shale tax got some of them very worried. And we heard them talking to each other and telling us when we went to see them, hey, well, I'm getting a lot of contacts. So we're trying to develop a capacity to mobilize people with our labor allies. So if you sign up to join us, we will put you on the list and let you know what's going on.
For people who are going to listen to this on YouTube or...
Yeah, the best way to do this is you go to website pachoice.org and something will pop up and ask you to sign up. So if you sign up at pachoice.org, you'll be on the list. And we'll give you updates about the budget, and we'll give you updates about what you can do to make it better. Because, part of what we're doing right now is trying to make this year's budget a little bit better. But a lot of what we're doing is trying to make the budget in 2021 and 22 and 23 a lot better. It's a long-term process. It took Alec 30 years to move this country to the right, and it's going to take us, I hope, a lot less time to move Pennsylvania back to where it should be. And if we don't, we're all going to suffer. Yes?
So I can actually attest to that since I'm with SEIU. And we've been working very closely with the Pennsylvania Budget and Policy Center, and they've been really incredibly helpful. I've visited several representatives, and that's one of the best things you can do, and I can tell you firsthand that if you visit your in-district representative, you can actually make a change, and I've seen it happen just over this past few weeks. The other thing is that if you're looking to do something locally, there is a project that will be going on in Scranton, and I have the details on that, to basically test a model, a working model of people that we believe might be persuadable based upon working ethics, rural ethics that we've been talking about. And please contact me. It's DwayneHeisler@gmail.com. I have a card here. I'll be here afterwards. But we need local people knocking on local doors to test this message, because it doesn't work shipping a bunch of people up from Philadelphia to do it. And you can join me to help me with that. And we already have a good start on that, and I'm excited about doing that because the urban or the rural model, when applied to Scranton, actually works very well. And it makes the doors very walkable, and we can knock this out in just 2 days. So that's something you can do right away in November to help us get our messaging squared away. And I love the idea of the video you were talking about, because I think that fits right in with getting away from that myth of the urban and rural divide. We are much closer together than a lot of people think, and so we just need to message it properly.
When was that website?
So the dates that they're looking are 2 Saturdays in November. It's the middle 2 Saturdays, so it's the 11th and the 18th, because the first one is the election, and the last one is Thanksgiving. And we don't want to do it into the winter where it's getting too cold. So those are the 2 Saturdays from 1 till 5 o'clock. We'll be meeting at the Southside Center, I believe. It's where Alfredo's is, in Scranton, the pizza place there. But I'll have my card here. Please come. And we're looking for people like you that are interested, that want to see a change, but also to really test this. It's a model. And so this is not show up, get your donut, knock on a door, check a box. This is really about some communication skills, and there will be some training that will happen that I'll be giving the week before on Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday as well, to prepare you for best practices when doing this, when knocking on doors. So just hang on afterwards, and I'll be happy to give you a card for that.
Everyone talks about property taxes as if it's a statewide problem, but in fact it's not. If you compare, by the way, I can make these available to people. I can maybe send you a link, and we can put this on our website if you want to see it. If you look at property tax either as a percent of home values or percentage of income, Pennsylvania is not especially high. So the idea that we have a statewide problem with high property taxes really isn't true. We're below New York, New Jersey. We're roughly around Ohio. It's just not. It's not a statewide problem. On the other hand, if you look at regions, there are places in the state where property taxes are extremely high. Mostly southeast, Poconos down through Reading, down to York, Lancaster, and some of the collar counties of Pennsylvania. They tend to be a lot higher there. Some of that is by choice, where communities want to spend more money on their schools, so they tax more. Some of it is because schools, there are areas where the economy has been somewhat stagnant, and they don't have the tax base to support the schools. If you look in the western part of the state, property taxes are really quite low. Now, here's another reason for that. In the western part of the state, population's declining. Yet school funding from the state's not declining. So you have a lot of school districts that are getting the same amount of money year after year, even though their school population's declining. It's no wonder they don't have to raise property taxes there. So again, we have a problem that's more a matter of inequity than a matter of just property taxes being high. So here's what SB 76 would do. It would place 100% of all school property taxes with state funds, except for property taxes used to pay off school construction loans. If a school district had borrowed to build a school, they'd still be responsible for that, for the part that the state hasn't paid for. Property taxes would be replaced by a big increase in the personal income tax and the sales tax. Income tax would go up to from 3.07 to 4.95%. Sales tax would go up a point. Plus the base of the sales tax would be expanded. That you might be paying sales tax on a lot of food and medicine, things like that. But here's the bizarre thing. They would fund the schools with exactly the same amount of money they get today. That is to say, property taxes would be replaced by state funding, but the amount of funding that schools get wouldn't change. Which means that the extreme inequality we have, and remember that inequality is even in certain areas from one district to another, or it's not just urban, rural, and so forth. That inequality would be locked in. And since the rules would make it very difficult for local communities to raise taxes by themselves, that would be locked in for perpetuity until the General Assembly made a radical change. And here's the really amazing thing. If you look at the average Pennsylvanian who would pay less in property taxes but far more in sales taxes and income taxes, their tax bill would go up on average by $334 a year. And in places where they went up, the money wouldn't even be going local. If you look at here, my favorite example from Reading. Lower Merion, which is a rich community right outside of Philadelphia, has the most expensive schools in the country. They would get $23,000 a year from an additional funding from the state, while Reading School District, which is very low funded, one of the worst funded school districts, would only get $1,000. Yet people in Reading would be paying more in taxes, and the additional taxes they pay would be going to Lower Merion, while people in Lower Merion would be paying less. This is a plan to rob from the poor and give to the rich, all in the name of eliminating property taxes.
And Mark, clarify for this. So if, for example, Wilkes-Barre School District or Dallas area school district who are now have built new schools or are building new schools, so your personal income tax would go up to 4.95, your sales tax would go up to 7%, and they would expand it to X number of products that are not, you would still pay 82% of your property tax until the debt of your school district was eliminated. Am I right?
I don't know the details about that district, but a lot of school districts would still, that have substantial debt, they'd be paying it. You're right.
That's correct. So Wilkes-Barre is going to go in debt $100 million. Dallas is in debt X number of million. So those people have three taxes. So that's why.
Right. Again, their taxes go up. They don't save that much money in property taxes, and their money goes to very wealthy districts that have a lot of property taxes and can afford them because they're wealthy.
How is that formularized?
What do you say?
How is that formularized? How does that?
Like
How
which
does that?
district gets how much?
Why does Lower Merion
Because
get 23,219%?
because Lower Merion taxes itself very heavily, has very high property taxes, and because it's a very, very rich, it's one of the richest communities in the entire country. So since we're going to replace all property taxes with state money, and we're going to fund the schools at the same level they are now, then Lower Merion has to get more money. I mean, it's just insane. You're asking people in poor communities to pay more, and their own schools don't get more, and all the money goes to all those very rich communities that have high property taxes. Now, if you tell me money goes to poor communities that have high property taxes, that makes a certain amount of sense. But it going to a rich community that has high property taxes, they don't even want it. The representatives from Lower Merion are against it because they know it's unfair. As I said, I've been a political scientist since I got my PhD in the 1980s. I've studied this for years. I've been working in politics for 10 years. This is the single craziest piece of legislation I have ever seen in my life. Really. And you know, if you tell me, let's raise state taxes and put the money through the school funding formula, so it goes to poor communities, it goes to poor communities that pay higher taxes, then now we can talk. But if the money is just going to replace money for rich districts, this makes no sense at all. This shows you who actually, you know, the middle class taxpayers are the ones who pay more. Almost everyone pays more, but it's the middle class between $22,000 and $104,000 a year. They're going to pay a lot more. And here's the dollars per student. We've divided the 500 school districts into 4 groups of 125. The highest poverty ones are here. The lowest poverty ones are here. The highest poverty district will get $3,700 a year per student. And the lowest poverty district will get $10,000 per year per student from this program. This is total Robin Hood in reverse. And there are plenty of alternatives. The first thing we need to do is we should move from being fourth from the bottom in terms of state funding of education up higher. We only pay for 37% of K-12 education with state funds. The average is about 46%. If we just raise the amount we spent and put it through the fair funding formula, we would reduce property taxes in lots of places around the state. And then if there's some pockets which, because of their own economic circumstances, have very high taxes, we can add in funds through this homestead program to help them out even more. And we could do it far less cost with far less disruption in our schools, and without putting all our schools in a straitjacket that maintains this inequality. So that in a nutshell is what's wrong with 76.
Thank you.
Sure. Okay.